Happy today. I am William Brown from IamWilliamBrown.com. This is Disconnect to Connect, one word conversations. Um, as I say, this is brought to you by IamWilliamBrown.com. IamWilliamBrown.com is a place for conversations and items that helps you be yourself and to live your life. One thing that I've been spotlighting mainly because of this conversation here, is the U cards and the intention setting cards of purpose of the U cards. And so my U cards that I picked for today is I am purpose, you are kind, and the quote card is be you, the world will adjust. So with my intention set, I am going to introduce our word and then have a conversation. This word has really been a part of my business journey or my entrepreneurial journey, and also really how I show up in my life, and just looking at the narratives or the stories that come up, and to be quite honest, it's really has hit me negatively, because there's a feeling that there is a lot of stories or narratives that you have to we you, I'm kind of forced to be in. There's not this feeling of creating my own narrative. It is kind of going along with the prevailing narrative. But I don't want to get too far within this conversation without my friend. So I will bring in my friend and we will have a conversation. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Brown.
This is a time of the show where I ask my guests to introduce themselves however it feels comfortable.
Well, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here on this fine Tuesday. Well, my name is Charles Gupton, and I have been a commercial photographer for more than 40 years now, and a filmmaker for a little over 10 years, along with my wife, Linda, who is a writer and producer. We have been working with companies of all sizes for, 40 years, uh, working with their narrative, with their corporate messaging. We've worked with companies from solo entrepreneurs to multinational companies around the world, doing photographs and messaging for them. And what we've realized is that story, our narrative, is the driving focus of, of communications that
Mm,
make an impact on what they do.
right. Wonderful. No, I like I said, I totally get that. So the question of the day is, how does narrative land for you?
Well, again, as I just said, it was a common thread that weaves its way through all of our work. We've
Right.
recognized that the need to tell a compelling story that has impact is what drives the connection between a company and its buyer, or the
Right.
people that it serves. So many companies focus on getting a website and just getting some kind of messaging up there that is within their industry, makes them sound like every other company.
Right.
Or, I mean, it's difficult to tell one company from another in terms, frequently, if it's in law or if it's in medicine, how to determine that one company is different than another
Right.
is quite a struggle, because so few of them are willing to take the risk of being different. But it's that differentiating factor that makes a difference in connection. So narrative is that that story that not only differentiates who we are, but it gives a compelling why we do what we do. What we
Right.
have found in our work through all these years and led us to a relatively new initiative that we call Transition to Thrive is working particularly with growth minded women who are business owners who are
Right.
looking to make a transition into more impactful work in
Right.
their lives. Frequently, they have incredible knowledge and breadth of abilities, but as we all have difficulty with, it's difficult with messaging to figure out how we present or how we connect with other people, because as you've heard the line before, I'm sure it's virtually impossible, if not impossible, to read the label when you're inside of the can. And we live inside of our own minds, inside of our own jars or cans, if you will, and we can't see objectively what's on the outside. So a lot of our work is in helping to define and refine that messaging or narrative to make an impactful connection. What we have found in this process, though, Bill, is that this isn't just a corporate message. It
Right.
really is an everyday message that we're all walking around with stories in our heads. Human
Right.
beings are story making factories. We're machines cranking out hundreds or thousands of stories in our minds every day. I mean, there's stories about, why did my spouse say that to me? Oh, he or she must have meant this. Are
Right.
my kids not cleaning his or her room? Oh, they are being rebellious, or they are doing this. It's a story that we're creating.
Right.
We we assign intentions to other people, or we assign kind of forgiveness to our own stories, our own intentions, by going, oh, well, I didn't mean that, or why are they thinking this way? And they're not necessarily based in reality. They're just based in what serves us at that moment. So, in terms of how it lands with me in thinking about my life, is I borrowed a phrase that I love from Brene Brown, and that is, when I'm in the midst of a story or in the midst of a conversation where the story's going,
Right.
a lot of times in my marriage with Linda and I or with other folks, either I'll say out loud or else in my mind, I'll silently say, the story in my head is,
Right.
and then I try to fill that in and go, this is my story in my head. So it is a word, and I'll use narrative and story interchangeably quite a bit,
Right.
but the story in my head or the narrative in my head is this. And
Right.
if I can tell that story even in a couple of seconds to myself, I go, that's my story. It may or may not be based in reality. How do
Right.
I get it to align with reality?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I can see that. I guess the interchangeability of, of narrative and story, and I get that. But most of the way that it feels with me, and it's something that I mentioned within the I guess my intro, is that it feels like there is this ongoing narrative, or there is this global narrative that I feel the need to fit into. It's one reason why I watch the news with a grain of salt. Is because it feels as if that instead of getting news, right, instead of being present, it is a retelling of something. And it's like I try not to live my life that way, that I am just I wake up and retell my life instead. I relive my stories. I have this ongoing narrative. It is I my challenge or my goal, and that's why I say happy today, and that's why I work hard to live in the present, is to really have this newness of my life. this news, this is like, oh, this is what's happening. Hey, I've had my, a conversation with, with my wife today, and this is what we discuss, and this is how it's forwarding the story versus retelling of, and I think for me that I'm trying to embrace the stories of my life, and and the story of my life, if that didn't get too
Right.
confusing,
Absolutely.
without just putting it on auto repeat, right?
Right.
And just kind of go from there. And it's just really, something that I sometimes I feel like I'm being a contrarian, and just kind of like, well, I'm not going to, this is what you're saying, and I'm just going to, take my pen and kind of create something else. And it's really not about that. It's just really trying to, in some cases, see where I fit, or if I want to fit within the story or the narrative that is being
Right.
created.
Right. And I think that is a an outgrowth of self-awareness that
Mm,
you and I have had conversations about, I'm sure, multiple times through the
right.
years.
Right.
That awareness to recognize, again, what is the story that's being told? What's the narrative in my head? What's the narrative, the cultural narrative that's going on around me and all of us? And I
Right.
think the media these days, it's a good place to look at what is the narrative being told, or what are the narratives being told from
Right.
various sides, and what are the interests that they have behind them. And to watch the news or to listen to any media without that awareness of yourself, where it's coming from, who's telling the story, and what are
Right.
the motivations behind it are
Right.
critical. And having been a part of the media for 40 plus years, working in newspapers and working for magazines such as Newsweek and Time and Life and Business Week and Forbes, to corporations, and again, on kind of both sides, both the private sector, corporate media, if you will,
Right.
corporate communications media, and then working in the news media, I I've come to understand that everybody has an agenda. It's all a business. The news media is a business,
Right.
and they have a narrative they need to tell, and they need to spice it up with a certain breaking news kind
Right.
of energy,
Right.
because it's that immediacy that keeps people coming back. If we said, here's just a very slight variation on a story that we told 3 days ago,
Right.
no one's going to come back. And
Right.
advertisers aren't going to pay for media
Right.
in which the percentage of people listening is small.
Right.
So to keep that business model in mind is helpful to realize they're telling a story a particular way because they have to sell advertising.
Right.
And it is a business. Without that, we would have to pay for it in a different way. So we pay for it with attention, if you will. But it has an impact on us, and it has an impact on the narrative that we're telling and hearing.
Right.
And I like to circle back a little bit, because all of this, in my view, comes back to a sense of power. And
Huh.
that power, I love a definition that I got from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And I'm going to read this because his definition of power is the ability to produce intended effects. The ability to produce intended effects.
Hmm.
And it's a very simple definition, and it's one without a sense of trying to get power over other people, but to think every day what we are trying to do is to get intended effects. Again, it may
Hmm.
be in a conversation with our spouse or with our children or with a
Right.
coworker. But what are the effects that we want to achieve?
Right.
And story and the narrative that we're both telling in our minds and that we're having in a conversation with other people is an incredible opportunity to get the effects or the impact that we want or that we intend in a way that allows us to not have power over somebody, but to
Right.
be empowered with them in collaboration to getting what we want done. If you want your child to clean their room, for instance, I keep coming back to that.
Right.
How do you work with and have a narrative around or a story around getting that impact or that job done without having a conflict in the process and without having to be at odds with the narrative, if you will, in that other person's mind, to
Right.
define what the issue or the intended result is and find ways to work together to get there. That
Right.
is where a good story, if you will, serves everybody to a good outcome.
Right. Here's the I guess the challenge or the thing that I'm bumping up against, and I think maybe that's sometimes why I have a hard time with power because I bump up against this. It is, the thing of manipulation, right? Feeling that, propaganda, manipulation, it's like just telling the story. I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have a street sign that I got commissioned that there is a street of influence and mediocrity. So I can either go down one of those streets, right? I like when I get to the crossroads, I can make a decision. And the reason why I I embrace or I connect with influence versus impact is because I currently feel that me trying to make an impact on something or have power or intent or something is me forcing it on someone. It's like forcing my will on them. And so I don't want to have a narrative or I don't want to create a story that imposes on someone, but is just available to someone. And that's why, for me, the news is like imposing. It feels like it wants to cause me to be upset about something. It causes me to,
Of course.
and it's just like, I want nothing to do with that. But I understand the power of story and narrative, and the need for it, right? But at the same time, how a narrative and story is used really kind of bumps up against some things that I'm dealing with, and and trying to just be type
Right.
of thing.
Well,
Hopefully that made sense, right?
absolutely. Well, to your point, we have, I think, unfortunately, devolved into a culture of us versus them on
Right.
almost every level. It
Right.
was once the U.S. versus Russia, or it may have been when I was a kid in cars. It was Ford versus Chevy, or
Right.
it was one sports team versus another. And now we have become, unfortunately, I believe, it's us against them on almost every front. And
Right.
rather than defining ourselves through a story of what do we have in common in terms of what is my why and how does that link with and connect with other people, instead what's uniting many people these days is who is the enemy that unites us. You
Right.
know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
I can't remember whether it's Voltaire or how far back that goes, but
Right.
we have now started aligning with and making friends with those who have a common enemy. And that
Right.
becomes our narrative of what do we stand against rather than what we stand for. I remember a quote years ago that I read from Mother Teresa when she was asked to join a protest. And her response was, I don't want to be a part of a protest. I don't want to be against something, but give me something to stand with in what we're working with together, and
Right.
I'll join you.
Right.
And from my perspective, having the narrative of what unites us to work together as opposed to being against something. And to your point about impact and influence, and I think there's a subtlety, but a connection between those two, is not forcing the impact on someone, but
Right.
more of guiding or leading, directing them into the impact that they are seeking to have.
Right.
And how to do that in a way that actually allows it to get done, as opposed to just burning a lot of calories on rhetoric, but
Right.
not really tangibly, actionably getting the impact they want to happen. Um, there's a lot
Can
of noise, but not a lot of
yeah.
action.
The question that just came up for me, and maybe it's just for the air or for the room, is that can a narrative or a story just be neutral? It just like as what Friday, just the facts, right? Just
Right.
have we is that really never really the case? Even if we say just the facts, it is still with some intent. The
Right.
facts that we share, the
Right.
story that we tell, there is an intent in that. So it is as soon as we open our mouth or write it down, something something down opposed to what we leave off, there is there is a bias, there is an intent there. It's no longer neutral.
Absolutely. And looking at the facts as, again, as Joe Friday would ask for just the facts, as you said,
Right.
would imply that we're logical creatures and
Right.
that our decisions can and are made in any basis on logic.
Right.
Whereas, as you are probably already aware, that uh, relatively recent fMRI research shows that in our brains, we are emotional creatures.
Right.
And it's now science, or at least has been indicated by science, that all of our decisions in the end are emotional decisions. That part
Right.
of our brain that fires at the point we make decisions are in the emotional sections of our brain. And we've used logic to justify or rationalize why we do it. So when we get the
Right.
facts, and again, the political debate or cultural debate around issues can be both sides have facts, but those facts are all based on their bias, on the
Right.
narrative they've got going on in their head. And yes, they are facts, but what do those facts lead to? Or where have they come from? And they've
Right.
come out of and they lead to more emotional provocation. And as human beings, we are meaning seeking creatures. We
Hmm.
want certainty in our lives,
Got
we
it.
want meaning. Whatever we're doing, we're looking for, whether we acknowledge it or not, the why of something. We want meaning behind it. And we also want certainty. We don't want to lead ourselves into deeper and deeper uncertainty. It's
Right.
extremely difficult to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty. But that's where I believe the better questions are found. When we're
Great.
sitting in uncertainty, we seek deeper questions or more thoughtful questions that lead us into what I believe is a better and more thoughtful set of answers or story, if you will, that help us understand the why of what we're doing, the why of its purpose, and the meaning behind it.
Right. No, I've adopted a couple years ago, a saying that things don't happen for a reason. Things happen and we give them reason, right?
Right,
Right.
right,
It is that type of a way of looking at the world and looking how things happen, and how we tell our story, how we create the narrative. It's the narrative is an ongoing story, right? Or a series of
absolutely.
stories and everything. I think that the connection with my business, and I think the real reason why I don't want to say I've taken so long is because there were so many parts of my story that that I felt that were valuable that I was leaving out. So it's like, well, okay, well that's not what I want to create. So so it's like, okay, how can I fit as much of me or my story in this story of my business or the thing that I'm trying to create, so I can stand with it, because there is, even with the conversation around labels, it is, I label myself a business life coach.
Right.
And how I explain that, or how I kind of unpack that for people, is that I have business conversations with a listening for your life. And for me, I had to label it that way instead of saying I'm a business coach and a life coach. It's like there is a totally different. And the reason why like I said, I label it like that is because that's how I show up in my life. That's the story that I'm telling myself, is that too often in the past that I would only have business conversation with no listening to my life. It's like,
Right.
this is what's happening in my home and it can't happen in my business, so I'm not going to talk about this. I'm just going to go to work.
Right.
And that worked until it didn't, right? Right? And it's like the more that I am able to show up in my work or show up in my business and have a listening and a knowing as what's going on, how does life occur to me right now? What is going on in my life that can help or get in the way of me showing up in my work? Then I can show up fully.
Absolutely.
And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it,
Right.
right? But it's that type of thing. And the more that it's not just owning our story, but just understanding the stories that are coming, that I guess has happened, right? And at the same time are happening, you know at the same time. And then how we, I guess, tell that story.
Right. Well, to your point of owning your story, as you said that, it occurred to me also by listening and examining the stories that are owning us.
Right? Wow.
Because there are stories in our minds, there are stories in our culture right now around a number of movements and a number of shifts, and those stories are beginning to own us. They're
Right.
taking us in, and we're becoming part of that story rather than listening and examining on the outside, whether it's listening to the media or listening to other people, or whether it's through meditation or whatever form, journaling may
Right.
be one, that we listen to our own minds, heart stories, if you will, and make sure that we are forming a story or a narrative that we can embrace and that we can own with intention and thoughtfulness, as opposed to being owned by it. And
Right.
so many folks, and this is part of where what drew me back, drew both of us back as we were working with business owners and trying to help them find what the limitations were that they were struggling with in their business. And increasingly, it kept coming up that there were not business issues that they were trying to find. There were personal issues in their story, in their narrative. The stories were
Right.
owning them about how worthy they were of success, how
Right.
worthy they were of making money, how worthy are was the possibility that they could have influence or impact or to make a difference outside of themselves or even within themselves.
Right.
And it's difficult to go into the world with the story of any kind of power, again going back to that definition of producing those intended results
Right.
or effects, if we have a narrative that we're not capable or worthy of doing it, if that story is owning us.
Right. Wow. I think, just going back to power for a moment, within the narrative framework, I think some of the challenges that I see with power, right, is that there is that force that people, instead of allowing power to just happen, right, or
Right.
just kind of appear, through intentions and in activity, there is this force of power. There is this there is I'm just this adding to, and I don't even know what it is. It's like aggression, or there is something because you. Bec- I guess I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I feel because I don't have it or I'm losing it, I try to kind of control it and kind of force the will, power on the narrative, the story, what I'm saying, what I'm trying to do, type of thing, and it just causes more trouble than just telling my story, just
Right.
sharing it. If there is a sharing of power, then then it will be adopted. Then it will be listened to. And like I said, I don't know where that just came from, but it just feels like that the more that we try to force our stories and our narratives on people, the more that we lose it. You
Right.
know,
Absolutely.
the more that it gets away from us.
Right.
So
Absolutely. And I think even within this, the definition that I used earlier from Russell was that it is again, I'll just read it again, the ability to produce intended effects is that seeing power on a spectrum as opposed to an absolute. And on one end of the spectrum is the sense of power as something that, and I think of this as kind of old school power or established power,
right,
is one in which it is like a pie, or if it's something that is finite, say
right,
money, in which there are a a small percentage of people who have a tremendous amount of money, if you will, if you see money as a certain amount of power,
right,
and they want to hold on to that resource as tightly as they can and think of it as like again a currency, money. You want to hold on to it and increase that capital, increase that power, and use it judiciously, if you will, and use it with great force. And it comes from just a couple of places, and like a sledgehammer has great effect when it hits something.
right,
And then further out on the spectrum, or the other end of the spectrum, is power that's more like a current, like an electrical current or a water, pushing its way. You want force behind your water pump if you want to have water in your house. We've lived on a farm for 20 years, and I did the plumbing there and put in a water pump and laid the pipe. And at the end of that process, I wanted to turn on a faucet, and I wanted that water pump to force that water uphill so that I could drink and flush the toilet.
right,
And so there's a certain amount of power I needed that to happen. And so it's just because it has force behind it does not necessarily make it bad. It's just, what is that force for? So
right,
the end of the spectrum of what is the power that comes from collaboration? What is the
right,
power that comes when it's shared? A lot of what we have seen happen in the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, even to an extent, a number of years ago, the Occupy movement. It's a place where power is now being shared instead of coming down from one of three media channels. Back when we were young, there were
right,
three television
right,
networks. Now there are how many hundreds or
right,
thousands of networks.
right,
We now have Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and texting and all of these opportunities to communicate our stories. We don't have to go through gatekeepers to write a book or publish a book.
right,
Now that has spread out, it allows it to, well, again, you look at the gatekeepers shut out a certain amount of poor quality, but they also shut out good voices that could
right,
speak. Now the
right,
gatekeepers are not there in the same way, and the quality is not always maybe as high on some things, but more people are able to have a voice. And when we look at that collective power of many people being able to come together and quickly have, whether it's a flash mob or a flash riot, we can use communication tools and spread that out to where people can have an intended effect, whether it's what we would consider to be a good effect or a negative effect
Right.
is kind of a judgment call there. But there's a sense of collaborative. We can get together and have this kind of call. The two of us can have a conversation, or
Right.
you can open it up and have 25 or 40 people on the call,
Right.
and there's an impact that happens in that type of power, if you will.
Right.
And to turn it back again to narrative, what is the story that comes out of that? I mean,
Right.
if there have been some efforts where multiple people write a book, in terms of one writes a sentence, somebody writes the next sentence, somebody writes the following sentence, whether it's on
Right.
Twitter or wherever it may be, and that's a different kind of communication and a different kind of a story than one coming out of the mind and the fingertips of a single author.
Right.
One may not be worse than the other. There's times for good single old school, if you will, power of you got an education and you now hold a certain space, whether it's by degree or whatever. And if you
Right.
go to have brain surgery, I don't believe you want that done collectively. You
Right.
don't want a
Right.
collaborative team of
Right.
15 people gathering together, looking at YouTube and saying, I think this is the area we ought to cut. No, 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 let's try this one. Oh, let's cut. Whoop, that didn't affect
Right.
well. Let's do. You want
Right.
somebody, you hope that's a specialist and knows what they're doing. But possibly when you're coming up with a, uh, a communications campaign for a company, by having a diverse group of people from different ethnic backgrounds, different age groups, different cultural backgrounds, it allows for a more diverse perspective and story or narrative, if you will, to go forward from that company, because it has come from a number of different perspectives as opposed to
Right.
one perspective, or maybe 5 or 10 guys sitting in the room and they look virtually the same. Their
Right.
perspective comes from kind of a single or almost single source.
Yeah. I really it hasn't been a word that I have explored online yet, but it has come up a number of time of just what is diversity and what does that mean and how does that show up or how can it show up.
Right,
I've kind of talked about how I think it is not showing up as enough, or it's just put into one
right,
category of
right.
showing up because that's the story, that's the narrative of what diversity is. I think the one thing that you were mentioning, earlier is that the gatekeepers, of our stories are like gone, or there's not as many, or they have different
Yeah,
jobs. But I
absolutely.
think we have all. I'll speak for myself. I have turned into the gatekeeper. I have turned into the gatekeeper because of my story, is because then I start comparing my story to your story, to
Right,
somebody else's story. Then I kind of will say some of it or not because of the comparison, of it. And I am learning, or I feel that the time that I am in my life and the awareness that I have of myself, I can just tell my story. I can just be William Brown and be okay with that. And that's
hmm
just, and that's just that's just who it is. And have not a feeling or an ongoing feeling or a belief that, hey, my story isn't as interesting as Charles's story, or valuable, or worthy, and all that kind of stuff, because it's just my story.
right,
It is just, my experience and what I'm currently sharing, or my awareness of it. And I think that the process of that self awareness that we've talked about before is that, the self awareness that we have in our organizations, in our government, and in ourselves, really cause us to show up how we show up within our story.
Absolutely.
And I think, I don't know, how you have when you're coaching, businesses or something, is that what just came to mind is, do you know the show Undercover Boss?
Hmm.
It's fascinating, but it's like for me, it's so unrealistic. Or
Right.
it's troubling in some cases. And this is why it's troubling for me, is that are those bosses so unaware of their organization, that they have to like disguise themselves, to a level. I don't want to be that so unaware of my life
Right.
that I have to disguise myself and have people like tell me the truth. Like,
Right.
but that's it. In some cases, that's how, organizations are, and that's how we are. We are so unaware
Right.
of how we're showing up. We have no connection to our story. We have no
Right.
connection of
Right.
our narrative, type of thing. And we need to be undercover boss, right?
Right.
And,
Right.
to kind of get this awareness, of ourselves, and of how we are relating to people that we care about, and things that we want to do.
Right. Well, there's been a huge movement in the last several years to move away from specialists and just find the truth within you. You have all the truth you need within you.
Right.
And I don't necessarily argue that we do have a tremendous amount of that within us. If we invest the time and thought and intention to, again, whether it's meditation, journaling, going for long runs and deep thought while we're doing it, there's a lot of deep stuff within us that can bubble up.
Right.
But one of the great areas of awareness I believe that we are sometimes not aware of is when we need to ask for outside intervention, when we
Right.
need to have some outside counsel, whether it comes from a coach. I prefer, as you already know, I prefer mastermind group
Right.
environments,
Right.
because not only is there a facilitator that helps keep the conversation on track and ask probing questions, but there's also a group objectivity, if you will, if the group is well vetted, that will come back and say, no, that's a lie. It's not
Right.
true. And it's not about what we're saying on the outside. Often it's the stories, again, that are owning us. I
Right.
remember one group that I was in, not that I was facilitating, but I was a member of, and I was sitting in a hotel in Chicago and at a conference, ran back up the room because I didn't want to miss this. And I got kind of the spotlight put on me inadvertently. And I was talking about something, a project I was working on. And I was kind of laying it all out and thought, that's it. I've got it covered fairly well. And to a person, and there were all women in this particular group and me, and to a person, every one of them called me on it and said, nope, that's BS. That's not who
Right.
you are. That's not what it is. And they just stripped away all the layers of the story that I was allowing to own me,
Wow.
and just brought me to tears because it was so, I felt so vulnerable and so open. But it
Right.
was one of the most helpful and obviously memorable experiences, because I realized that I had lived in that lie to protect myself for so long that I was believing my own lie. I was believing a
Wow.
story. And having them strip that back helped me see a greater truth underneath it of what I was capable of, what needed to be done, and work that I wasn't doing. Or I prefer actually the word contribution over work sometimes. There were contributions that I needed to be
Right.
making that I was afraid of, and they just stripped away the excuses, all the
Right.
layers that I was piling on top. So back to your point is, there are times when we need to be aware that having people and influences around us that strip away some of those stories, that help us when we are covering for ourselves, are afraid of moving forward,
Right.
and to be aware that this is a time that I need, a Bill, or whoever may be there that I can go to and say, here's a story I'm telling. I do that a lot in my marriage. Is, I'll say, here's something I'm running up against, and here's my story. And Linda is a wonderful foil. She's not entirely objective. She lives within the story with me a lot, but there are many times that she'll stop me in the middle of something and say, that sounds like a story that you're telling yourself. Where's the reality it's based in? I go, oh,
Right.
And I start looking for excuses. I can't hide behind those because no, those are lies. Those are excuses. Right. And so the awareness to come to realizing I need some outside objectivity. But back to your point earlier is that we don't need to live our lives with coaches and masterminds and constantly reading books. I love books. They're a lot of my coaches, but I can constantly go to a new book, another resource, another webinar, another conference to get more answers. And the key is to take action on those things that I can take action on today. And tomorrow I'll have a new set of data that I can move forward on with that. And as we go, the story, the path we're on is a new path if we're continuing to whack our way through. If we're following a beaten path, then we're going to probably follow a certain story. But if we can allow ourselves at times to get off of a trail, sometimes we think we're lost and we're off the trail, but by kind of hacking and whacking our way through it back in, we discover new things. That helps inform, in a sense, who we are and where we're going with it, if you will. The story is not necessarily always set. It can be in the process of evolving, changing, the nuances of that changing as we go.
No, I totally get it, and I appreciate that. We could talk about this for hours because we are story making machines, right?
That we are.
Is there anything that's come up in this conversation, or that you would just want to leave everybody with within this?
Well, one thought that goes back to something you said earlier that is staying with me, and that is to look at circumstances as having their own story, if you will. We can look at, I'll look back and think, why did my parents not show me the love that I needed or deserved, or why was my child killed in a car accident? Why did that happen? What did God or the universe or something mean in that? Or I frequently hear people say, oh, this happened. The universe must want me to do this, or it's God directed me to this, as if there are some outside forces that are moving us. And that's not to say that there are not influences there. Right. I mean, again, it's a mystery to me. I don't know what those influences are, but I also don't believe that everything that happened for that purpose, to do something, to guide or direct. Sometimes things just happen. Right. Why did a thunderstorm come over and blow my internet out, or we lose power or something? Why did that happen to me? Or why did this car accident or a tire blow out? Sometimes things happen because they happen. Right. And the story or the narrative that we make out of that is of our own doing. We can choose the narrative that comes out of that. It just happened. And what can I do to make meaning out of it? I think one of the most influential books that I read was Viktor Frankl's In Search of Meaning many years ago, and I've read it several times since. And it helps me to go back and think, as you just said, we're meaning-making machines. We get to choose the meaning out of events, if you will, if there's any, but to choose them and to make a story that allows us to do something with it, as opposed to a story being created that we also made up. Right. That is going to start to own us, to say that bad things always happen. I grew up with a mother that everything that happened, she'd go, "Oh, bad things just, these negative things just always happen to me."
Right.
And even as a child, I, not really. There are a lot of good
Right.
things that happen. And it
Right.
helped me start to frame that we choose the meaning out of the events.
Right.
And we get to choose that meaning, that significance, and say, oh, there are a lot of great things that happened. Or this
Right.
thing that could be negative
Right.
also allows for an opportunity. The COVID pandemic, in my mind, opens up opportunities that we have never had
Right.
before. How can we choose a story that allows us to be more influential, impactful, positive, to see opportunities to serve people in ways that they may never have been open to being served before?
Right.
That's a story, that's a narrative, that's
Wow.
something we choose.
No. Well, well, thank you very much, sir. This is, I know there's a lot of moving parts, over there, and we don't talk as much as we have in the past, but it is always a pleasure to connect with you, my friend.
Thank you for the opportunity and enjoyed the connection.
Okay, and we'll say our goodbyes from the green room, but again, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, I got a lot of moving parts happening here. All right, here we go. I really appreciate that, and it's like there was within our before this conversation, and when I saw this word for myself, um, it was really how the narratives were controlling, that I felt that I had to fit in it instead of be a part of it. But what I got out of this conversation for me is that we have the pen. We have a say in the story, and I am looking for a plot twist. How is narrative showing up in your life? I would love to hear in the comments and to share with that. And I really hope, it is my prayer that these conversations, or this conversation in particular, has added value to you. And if you would like to have a conversation like this, I would love for you to go to iamwilliambrown.com and sign up for a complimentary coaching session, and just see what's showing up, what's keeping you from being yourself and living your life. As Charles mentioned, that it's not about owning your story, but looking at the story that is owning you. I really think those stories are the ones that need a little bit more conversation with. The world wants you, the world needs you, and the world is waiting for you. So go be you. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you soon.